Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad you could join us this evening. This is going to be incredible. So I'm Dr. Mike Bell, the Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. It's great to have you here tonight in the Madeline Paul Hilliard Conference Center. Of course, Paul was a Marine too, at the museum's own Higgins Hotel. And for those of you that are watching live stream and on C-SPAN, thanks to you for joining us. We're sure to share links and spread the word about tonight's wonderful program. So, it's going to be great. I'd like to carry on the museum tradition first by acknowledging any World War II veterans, homefront workers, or Holocaust survivors that we may have in person or watching online, and other online. So let's give them a round of applause. Next, as part of our tradition, I'd like to acknowledge any veterans of any era or any active duty service members. If you would please stand to be recognized for your service to our country. And I've got a little adjustment here too. And then any veteran and military spouses, would you stand too so we can say thank you to you for what you've done as well. Probably one of the toughest jobs out there. So this evening, service to our country is definitely one of the themes of this program, focused on General William H. Rupertus. And those of you familiar with the museum are aware that we try to track anniversaries as they come up. 80 years ago, the 1st Marine Division was completing its training in the U.S. down in North Carolina, preparing to deploy to the Pacific. Because this August will be the 80th anniversary of the start of the Battle of Guadalcanal, which turned into a grueling campaign between the American and Imperial Japanese forces, not only on land, but on sea and air in the Pacific. Now, one of the men who led the 1st Marine Division at Guadalcanal was General William H. Rapertis, whose life and career was more than just this first pivotal campaign in the Pacific. And for most people, you're not really sure who he was. You don't know much about him. And but he ultimately led first as the assistant division commander and then as the division commander for over 2 years in theater, from Guadalcanal through Peleliu. During that war, the 1st Marine Division was awarded 3 Presidential Unit Citations. Now, typically that's described as every member of the unit would have been recognized for heroism. Now, he was key to the first 2 of those 3 Presidential Unit Citations, which is an incredible achievement. Now, tonight we have with us 2 guests who co-authored the book we're about to hear about. Amy Rupertus Peacock is the granddaughter of General Rupertus and keeper of the family archives. Have to see what that looks like, a family archive. It's kind of cool. And then she's a graduate of the University of Georgia's Journalism School, and she's written for various newspapers. Her co-conspirator is Don Brown, a former U.S. Navy JAG officer and Special Assistant U.S. Attorney. Now, he's written 14 books, including a series on naval justice novels for Zondervan and the expose Call Sign Extortion 17. That's a pretty cool call sign. And mine was Mustang 6, which I thought was real cool, but Extortion 17 is kind of neat. Everybody's got a call sign, right? So with that, let me join me in welcoming to the stage Amy and Don, and we look forward to launching this event.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Hello, good evening. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Michael, for making this happen. And thank you to Jeremy for all your work. And thank you for everyone for being here and everyone that's online and at C-SPAN. I appreciate you being here. I hope that you will enjoy the story that Don and I are about to share. We've worked on it for quite a while, a couple of generations, actually. And my sisters, Kimberly and Heather, couldn't be here today, but they helped with this greatly, and Kimberly on a lot of the research. So what Don and I have done today is built a PowerPoint presentation. So I'm going to share my grandfather's story pre the Pacific, and then I'm going to hand it over to, when the Marines land in the Pacific, I'm going to hand it over to Don to share that story. So for those of you who don't know, General William H. Henry Rupertus was my grandfather. Yeah, he was born in 1889 in Washington, D.C. to a German-American community. And let's get this going. It's PowerPoint. There we go. Whoops. Let me back up. And he died in 1945, so he didn't get to see the end of the war. But during his lifetime, he accomplished a lot. He's most known for many things, but I'd say probably My Rifle, the Creed of the United States Marine. He wrote in 1942, after the Japanese had bombed us at Pearl Harbor. He was an expert rifleman and felt as though the young Marines, the young recruits flooding the system, needed to slow down and better understand their rifles before they went out to the Pacific. He did 2 tours in China as CO of the 4th Marines, also known as the China Marines, in the 20s and 30s. He led the 1st Marine Division in the Pacific, which Mike just talked about, for quite a while. He was the longest serving division commander in the Pacific during that time. The USS Rapertis was named in his honor in 1945. It's a naval destroyer, and it served our country from 1945 to 1973. There's still an active association on Facebook, and they try to meet every year, which is kind of neat. He did lose his first family to scarlet fever while he was stationed in China, in Peking, China, at the international settlement. And his story has never been told until now. So here we go. He came again from a German-American family. They emigrated to the United States in 1850, landed in Washington, D.C. to join a big German-American community that lived and worked there and thrived there. These are the patriarchs of the family, and Bill's father is on the left, our grandfather, Bill Rupertus. His family were retailers in D.C., and they also, his grandfather had a luxury goods store with merchandise from, Europe, and his father owned a restaurant and then a cigar store. For some reason, Bill, our grandfather, General Rupertus, decided to go to the military route, and he might have been inspired by his great grandfather who served in the Civil War. I'm not sure, but he attended McKinley Tech in high school in Washington, D.C. as a cadet. And then he went into the U.S. Revenue Cutters Service Academy, which is the predecessor to the Coast Guard Academy. And he was toured all around the world on their summer cruises. And he graduated second in his class of 14. But upon a medical exam, when he graduated, the doctor said that the Revenue Cutter School doctor said that he had Bright's disease and he would die in 5 years. So here's this young cadet who had just graduated, and he was told he would die in 5 years. So obviously that was kind of devastating. He didn't go forward with the Revenue Cutter Service, which he really wanted to do. And he thought about going back to, I skipped this, but he, after he graduated high school, he went into the DC National Guard, and he worked there for about 3 years, and he worked in naval gunnery. So he went from there to be a cadet at the Revenue Cutters Service Academy, and when he was told he would not live, he thought about going back to the National Guard, but something inspired him to join the Marine Corps and give his life, whatever left of his life he had, to the Marine Corps. So he joined the Marine Corps, and he got a commission in 1913, November 1913. He was immediately taken up to join the rifle team. So I guess he was an expert rifleman, and a couple classmates of his were picked up for the rifle team, and they competed from 1913 to 1915, all around pretty much the East Coast. But they did exceedingly well, as the Marine Corps says. And here, in the meantime, he also was asked to be on the USS Florida. So here's kind of a neat picture from 1918. But he had been working on the USS Florida for a couple years when this picture was taken. and he was a junior officer for the Marine detachment. And they were on their way to helping our allies in the war. And he was really an expert in fire control batteries. So back up. During this time, he also had his first son, William Jr. The next big station was Haiti. So there was a lot of unrest in Haiti in the early part of for a long time. But the Marines were called in. I think also, the Germans were prowling around about that time, and the Marines were called in. He went to Haiti in 1919 and was there from 1919 to 1923, and he was in charge of the Gendarme de Haiti. If anybody speaks French, they can probably say that better than me, but the Garde de Haiti. So he's the chief for about 3 years. And right here, this picture is pretty cool because you have the guard and behind them. So it's a diverse group. And then you have the Haitian president in the middle is retiring. And then the man on the right looking at him is the future president, Louis Bourneau, which is a neat picture. And Rupertus is on the right side over there. So that was accompanied. So he brought his wife and son as well there. Boop. Next big station was to Peking. Bill and his wife, Marguerite, and their son, William Jr., and daughter, Anne Rodney, because now they had a daughter, got their first Far East assignment to go to Peking, China. Then it was called Peking, and joined the legation guard there. So I'm assuming you all are a pretty knowledgeable crowd. You know that back in the 20s and 30s, we had, and earlier, but we had these island enclaves where Americans and Europeans could do business in China. It's part of the the results of the Boxer Rebellion that happened in the 1900. But anyway, each country would bring in their guards. So the American sector brought in the Marines, and Bill and his family went there. So here is a picture of the legation quarter. So it's a walled area. You can look it up online. There's a great site about the China Marines. They're called, the 4th Marines were called the China Marines. And you can see, if you can see this, that there were a lot of countries in there, from the Americans to the Russians to the Germans and the French and on and on. So again, each country brought their guards. So Rapertis was one of those guards and a commanding officer. Sadly, this was really hard when I was writing the research thing. This Rupertus, we always knew kind of that he'd lost his first family, but we really didn't know enough about it. And then when I researched it, I couldn't find anything about them. So eventually I got oral history reports and that sort of thing. He certainly didn't write about it. But scarlet, so in 1929, didn't give that time, but 1929, they arrived in Peking. And by December 1929, his little daughter came down with scarlet fever. And that was right before Christmas, and she died 12 days later. And then his wife, Marguerite, who was 38, and his son, Will, right there, got also got scarlet fever. And back then they couldn't cure it. So they were in the hospital for 2 months in quarantine. Rupertus went into quarantine, and his wife and son died in February 1930, 24 hours after within 24 hours of each other. He was still in quarantine, so he never got to see them or say goodbye, kind of like what happened with COVID. But so here he is, this officer. His children and wife have died. Bodies were shipped back to Washington to be buried at Arlington Cemetery. There were a lot of telegrams that went back and forth from the Marine Corps headquarters and Rupertus. He wanted flags on their caskets, and he wrote a check to pay for the flags. And of course, the Marine Corps said, "Oh no, we'll pay for them." But so he lost his entire first family, and people who were in the hospital at the time knew his wife and said she went septic, and it was just devastating. I mean, he wasn't the only one who. There were other Marines that got scarlet fever, but it really obviously affected him. And his mother, Augustina, wired him from Washington and said, Bill, you need to come home this is a huge shock. You need to come home. And he said, no, I can be better here. He can be better with his Marine Corps. I mean, it was at that time the only family he had left there. And he couldn't really leave because he was just coming out of quarantine, and it was his job, his duty. And there weren't that many Marines to come to the Far East and fill his position. So he stayed there until 1931. And the next picture you'll see, Colonel Holcomb, who was there, who went on to be commandant, really wanted the Marines officers to play polo to stay in shape. And everybody back then pretty much knew how to ride horses. So he thought that would be good for Bill General Rupertus, to get back in the saddle, if you will. And this is kind of a cool picture because here he is with, right next to him is Roy Chapman Andrews, who was an explorer in the Gobi Desert. And he was always hanging out with Marines in Peking because he had gone out and explored so much territory and would map it and then also put gas around. So that was very helpful to the Marine Corps when they went out on their adventures. So here's another picture. I think this is kind of an epic picture. You've got the Marine Corps band there. There's Rupertus trying to figure out, I don't know, what he's thinking, looking at the race. I don't know who this gentleman is with him, but then the next picture, you've got the Japanese officers, and they're kind of by themselves. And keep in mind, this is 1930. So by 1931, the Japanese would invade Manchuria. And then in 1932, they invaded, bombed Taipei and Shanghai. So you can see, I wonder what they're thinking in 1930, sitting there. But anyway. Okay, so the next event in his life, he comes back. He's at a party at the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C., and it's of China Marine veterans, and he meets Sleepy Rupertus. Sleepy, her name was Alice Hill Rupertus. She was much younger than he was, but she came from a Navy family and who had served the country for a long time. And anyway, they met each other and fell in love and married in 3 months. And so that's Sleepy and Bill on their wedding day. That's your grandmother, right? My grandmother, yeah. So that's Sleepy. So he got a new lease on life, and Sleepy was perfect for him. So they did a couple deployments together. Everything seemed to be accompanied back then. And their next big station was Shanghai, at the Shanghai International Settlement. So same thing. It's an island enclave. As you kind of can see from this picture, it's from 1930, but it still was pretty accurate by 1937 when they got there. But here you had, again, it's much more cosmopolitan. There were probably 3 million people living in the city at the time. And it was a lot of fun at first. And again, they arrived in April 1937. This is actually the photo that was online that Don found when he was researching his other book on Jerry Yellen. And he sent it to me. He said, "Hey, Amy, is that your grandfather?" And he's like, "You should write about him or tell a story about him." But yes, this is a party at the French Club with a couple Marines and Navy officers. The calm before the storm. And there's another picture with Sleepy and Rupertus on the right, and then that's Admiral Henry Yarnell, who was kind of the commanding naval officer in that area at the time. Then the Japanese came rolling in, and everything changed on August 13th, 1937. And as you can see, these are personal pictures. I don't know where our grandfather got these, but I'm assuming he took them or a friend took them. But it was just total devastation. Overnight, everything changed. The Japanese had been slowly eating away at China, and then they came in and did this huge attack on Shanghai, which I think is underreported. But he was right there. So what happened is the Marines immediately went, and everyone I think went into lockdown. You know, the gates went up, the sandbags came out, the Marines went out with their rifles around the perimeter, at least the American sector. Every nation's guard went on alert, and it was pretty intense. Here's a picture, again, Shanghai, 1937. He's the only one, well, the guy on the right with little hair. They're obviously having some kind of strategy session here. And here is a photo I love. It's a Marine Corps photo, but obviously this Marine is on the perimeter, and he's ready for anything that's going to come at him. But if you can imagine, they're seeing around this perimeter, the outside is total war. I mean, the Japanese were very brutal, and it was a very violent scene before them, but they were told to hold fire. From the president on down, they did not want to engage the Japanese in 1937. But these Marines did. They didn't engage, but they sat there for months having to do this and be on alert and stay on fire. And they had stray shrapnel come into their eyes and stray gunfire, and the Japanese would taunt them, but they held strong and did not fire. There might have been some fistfights, but they didn't get into any real action. So here's some more pictures. This is a picture. So I forgot to say that when the Japanese bombed Shanghai, our grandmother and all the anybody that could be evacuated did get evacuated. They went either to the Philippines or some went back to the United States. Our grandmother went to the Philippines, where her sister Jo was with her Navy husband. But they did come back in December. So they evacuated in August. They got back about December. And here's a picture of a Japanese officer escorting them around. And there's the Rupertuses, the Krulaks are there, General Krulak and his wife, and some other Marine officers. So that's what he got to see. And here's a situation map. It's kind of tough to see, but it was obviously pretty intense. And you can, well, in the book, I have some information about this, but there's lots of stuff online. Okay, so fast forward, 1938, they finally come back, August 1938, they finally come back from China, and my dad is born at the Marine Barracks at 8th and I. Big celebration. Rupertus has an opportunity to have another child, so that was good. My dad went to the Naval Academy, and he went on to be a Marine aviator, and he flew in Vietnam. So his name is Patrick Hill Rupertus. So right after, let me back up here real quick, and then we'll move on pretty quickly from here. So this is 1938. He had a couple more deployments to Guantanamo Bay, and then he got to, in 1941, November, he arrived in San Diego at the Marine Corps Base, San Diego, and he was going to be Chief of Staff to he was Upshur. And then all of a sudden, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked. And it was interesting. I wonder what his perspective was, because back in Shanghai, you had Marine officers in 1937, Colonel Price being one of them, writing to General Vandegrift to blow off some steam, that if we don't take care of the Japanese in Shanghai, that are in Shanghai at the time, attacking in Shanghai, they will come to our shores. And he has more descriptions about him. I won't get into them. But so fast forward, this is 1939. Then the Japanese bomb us in 1941. Our grandfather is at the Marine Corps Base, San Diego. General Upshur gets promoted. Our grandfather gets promoted to be the commander of the base. And all of a sudden, all these recruits come flying into the Marine Corps depot to sign up to go, take revenge. And our grandfather, being an expert rifleman, being on the rifle team, really felt like, oh my gosh, he knew the enemy because he had seen them in China. And he knew they were going to the Pacific, which was going to be tough environmentally. And he knew that the rifle was going to be really important. So he wrote this rifle creed, not as a preachy, but he really, really wanted to, have them engage the Marines' hearts and minds around their rifle, and that their rifle was their friend, and it would help them and their brother in the Pacific, and help win the battle on the ground in the Pacific. So he wrote My Rifle, the Creed of a United States Marine. It was published in the Marine Corps San Diego Chevron, and it's been recited for a long time since then. So this is the original one that was in the Chevron, and this is one I've been memorizing it, but it's changed a bit over the years. So here's another version of it. So fast forward, he's in San Diego. General Vandegrift is one of his friends. He gets called to join the 1st Marine Division and help in the formation training of the 1st Marine Division in New River, North Carolina, called Tent City back then. Now it's Camp Lejeune. But by April 1942, so by March he was up there. By April they were in Solomon Islands, Maryland, watching the amphibious training. Here's Secretary of the Navy Knox, then Colonel Pete DeValle, General Holcomb, Commandant, and the Rupertus. And they were training inland because, of course, the Germans were on the East Coast. So this is where I'm going to let Don jump in, my wonderful co-author. We wanted to really give you a little background of Rupertus, and here the Marines are getting ready to join the Pacific. So Don, without further ado. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Amy. How's everybody tonight? Y'all a good-looking group. I want to begin. I'm going to say a couple of words to stall so the wonderful AV team can get the second PowerPoint up. But I first want to start by wishing you all a happy Flag Day. And I can't think of a better place. Yeah, go ahead and applaud for Flag Day, for Old Glory. God bless America. And cannot think of a better place to spend Flag Day, even if I weren't talking about one of the greatest officers in American military history, is certainly most significant in World War II, than the National World War II Museum, which is a national treasure to us all. And of course, I want to thank Colonel Bell, Jeremy Collins. Thank you, General Mize, for being here. Also want to recognize a young man named Bruton Peacock, who is Amy's son and is the great-grandson of General Rupertus. And I spent some time with him the last couple of days, and he's got it in his genes, baby. He's the real deal. So please welcome Bruton as well, if you would. Thanks also to the AV team, and thank you to C-SPAN for covering events such as this, especially when we're talking about events of significant national importance. And I think this is, because as I said a moment ago, I believe that General William Rupertus is one of the most significant officers in the history of the Marine Corps. Yet, as Amy said, this is a story that has not fully been told yet. Why is this? Could be because he died early. He was, as Amy said, the longest serving commander of the famed 1st Marine Division, the old breed, in World War II in the Pacific. His friend, General Vandegrift, was the second longest, and they served almost the same amount of time, but General Rupertus served a little longer. As we'll see, he was the commander in charge of some of the most significant battles in the Pacific. And yet he still is a mystery to most of us. He is unfortunately known sometimes only for the Battle of Peleliu. We'll talk about that in a second. But what we want to do, and we understand, I think I've got, there we go. There's a new PowerPoint. But I think that what we have sought to do here, and we understand that tonight we are honored to be in the presence of some of the most significant military historians in the country. So we may not teach you guys anything, maybe a couple of things, but we've sought to write a book that will introduce General Rupertus' story to the American people, and to introduce not only the general himself, but to tell part of the story of what the 1st Marine Division was doing in 1942 through 1944 in the war. So we're honored, very, very, very honored and grateful to be here with all of you tonight. Now let's set the stage. It is early 1942. And we're in a situation where, of course, there's been Pearl Harbor. The Japanese are wreaking havoc all over the Western Pacific. They've taken the Philippines. The British protectorates in Singapore and Malaysia have fallen. They basically totally control Westpac, which is an acronym for the Western Pacific, for those of you who might have been in the military. We know about the notorious Bataan Death March. which comes about in April of 1942, and then General Wainwright, of course, winds up surrendering. The numbers, some of y'all know better than me, 70, 75,000 combined American and Filipino forces. It is arguably the largest defeat, perhaps the most significant defeat in the history of the United States Army. We can debate some of this stuff in the Civil War, but certainly in the 20th century. America is in need of a victory on the ground. Now, the United States Navy, of which I'm very grateful to be a veteran, engages, and of course, at Coral Sea in 1942, the Navy fights the Japanese Navy. Some say to a stalemate, some say it's a victory. Basically, we're able to stop some of the Japanese naval advance, but they are still dangerous out there with multiple aircraft carriers. And then we see Midway in June of 1942, and in one of the greatest naval victories in the history of the world, I would argue up there with Trafalgar. Did I say that right? I grew up in the South, so I butcher a bunch of words, but one of the greatest naval victories in the history of the world, in which the United States Navy, by the grace of God and some good weather, are able to take out 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. That is a great victory, and it certainly is a strategic turning point in the war, but the war is far from over. America, as I say, needs a victory on the ground. You're seeing a photograph there of the notorious Bataan Death March. Enter Major General William Rupertus. As we'll see, he is historically significant for a number of reasons. First, there are 4 historically significant battles in World War II in which he commanded. There's the Battle of Tulagi, which is part of the Solomon Islands campaign right there. As far as we know, this is the first ground victory in the war in the Pacific, and perhaps even the first American ground victory. I'm talking about American ground victory in World War II. As you may remember, Operation Torch in North Africa began in November of 42. So we're talking about August of 42, before the Army is yet to get fully engaged in Europe. Now, Jeremy has given me 2 clickers. I got a pointer and a clicker, so I could get confused here. So if you bear with me, that'd be great. He commanded the Battle of Henderson Field, which was the final battle on Guadalcanal, which basically broke the backs of the Japanese on Guadalcanal. This is where where the Medal of Honor was won, and by the great Marine. Who was the Marine? Say again. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And then they had the Battle of Cape Gloucester at New Britain, and the Battle of Peleliu in the Palau Islands. And so those are the 4 victories that he commanded and won. Now, let's take a look at the situation here. We moved to August 6, 1942. This is three years to the date before we dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. We have a naval task force moving from south to north toward the Solomon Island chain, and this is where it's all going to start. The 1st Marines at this time are commanded by General Vandegrift. General Rupertus is the deputy commander, and they're going to move in, and they're going to strike first at a place called Tulagi, and I'm going to explain that just in a second. All right, you're seeing right here General Rupertus on the bridge of USS Neville, 7 August 1942. Another shot of the general as they begin their landing operations, which commenced at approximately 8 a.m. that morning. This is a overall map of Guadalcanal and the Solomon Island area. You can see Guadalcanal is a huge island. It looks kind of like the state of California sitting out there in the water. But the little red area here is going to be Tulagi, and I'll show you Tanambogo and Gavatu just in a moment. The Japanese were headquartered on Tulagi Island in the Solomon Islands. The British had this Tulagi had previously been the headquarters for the British. They had abandoned it back in the spring when the Japanese forces were becoming too powerful. The Japanese had set up their military there and seaplane bases that can threaten our Marines. I've got a couple of maps here showing the approach of the 2 naval task forces, and they're going to be coming in here. General Vandegrift's group is going to be coming to Guadalcanal. General Rupertus will be coming into. You can see Tulagi there right off Florida Island, which is a larger island. This is a little bit closer in, showing the approach again of the two task force. They're coming on the morning of the 7th. They make course corrections, and they're moving straight in. So D-Day at Tulagi, which is going to occur before we land at Guadalcanal, because we have to neutralize the Japanese air power there. among other things, is set for 8 a.m. Before the invasion begins, we have warplanes, the USS Wasp, Saratoga, and Enterprise, about the only workable carriers the Navy has at the time, launching pre-suppression fire, which is important military doctrine, as many of you know. And we see what's going to go on here. So this says TG, that should be TF. Task Fort Yoke is General Rupertus' Marines, 2,500 or so, headed toward Tulagi, and there's Gavatua and Tanamboga. Task Force X-Row is coming in here under the command of General Vandegrift. They will eventually land without opposition initially. It's the Solomon at Guadalcanal, which is not the case on Tulagi and Tanambogo. A little bit closer map here of Tulagi, and then the islets of Tanambogo and Gavatua. They are coral islets, and this is where the Japanese have very dangerous seaplanes here. Any bomb from one of those seaplanes could take out any of our ships in the area. We got to take them out. So Tulagi Island is about 3.4 miles in length. It kind of looks like I compare it a little bit the way Cuba looks a little bit, but it's much smaller. It's about half a mile, a little wider than that, at its widest point. As you can see, the operation begins at 8 o'clock a.m. This is the first active operation by the U.S. Marine Raiders, which were formed, and they were under General Rupertus' command. Major Edison and his group will move into what we call Blue Beach here, and I'll show you they're going to turn to the right and kind of sneak in behind the Japanese. Now, I want to talk about one of the things that General Rupertus doesn't get credit for because you don't know about him. But this was not only the first, we believe, amphibious invasion, but it was a risky maneuver at Tulagi because the Japanese are located down here in the southeastern quadrant of the island. That's where they are. Around the northwestern section, all up here, what we have treacherous coral, okay? So in other words, the Japanese are not anticipating anybody coming in here because of the coral. They think they've got a natural defensive barrier. So Rupertus plans a daring mission. His Marines bring their Higgins boats. You know, we're a great place to be for New Orleans, but up to the beginning of the coral, and the guys jump out in the water. And so the water is up to their necks and sometimes over their necks. So they wind up walking in, and they're going to execute this maneuver to the right and basically catch the Japanese are expecting something because we started bombing them, but they're not expecting to get hit from the backside. So this is a brilliant maneuver. And here we see our raiders on the morning of August 7th actually coming in. They've jumped over the coral. They're walking in. The Japanese don't yet know that they're there. There are a couple of snipers in the area that get taken out, but this operation was basically a surprise. U.S. Navy photo taken on the morning of the operation. We can see the raider units are going to be moving in here. There's a ravine there. There's a hill 220 that is going to be defended by the Japanese, and we're going to have to take that out. Tulagi is going to fall in about 3 days. This is more of an overview of the strategic situation. The raiders are here. They're coming in, and they're going to move to the south. Remember, they're going around this coral reef. And down here at Tanambogo and Gavatua, which I mentioned, are two very small coral-type islets where we have the Japanese have seaplanes that are dangerous and armed. We're going to see the 1st Parachute Battalion. This is a group kind of like the Marines had at one time. It's no longer an active unit, but that operation on Tanambogo and Gavatua is scheduled to begin at 12 noon after we've already moved on to Tulagi. These are photographs that are taken again from U.S. Navy recon, but this is Tulagi burning. The Marines have come in here and have moved down this way, and the Japanese are concentrated here. These are these hills I've mentioned to you, and there you have it. This is a little closer look at Tanambogo and Gavatua, which of course had to be taken because of the seaplanes. 1st Parachute Battalion comes in here, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines here and here. Gavatua is the larger of the two islets, and Tanambogo is at the top. Tanambogo and Gavatua are connected by basically a strip of coral right there that kind of connects the two. This is a little bit harder. Gavatua and Tanambogo will fall on August the 9th, which if you're in the dates like me, that will be 3 days, 3 years to the date before Nagasaki. A photograph of Gavatua and Tanambogo burning. So again, just some maps here that we're showing. Now, all this led up to something called the Battle of Sabah Island. Some of you might know about Sabah Island. Sabah Island is one of the, we didn't lose as many guys at Sabah Island as we did. It's a naval battle. There were 5 naval battles basically surrounding the entire 5 major naval battles surrounding the entire Guadalcanal campaign. On the night of the 8th, the day after D-Day, the Japanese are going to come in here, and we have American and primarily American, but also Australian cruisers that are set here, and their job is to defend. Right now here what we have is we have the transport ships that are carrying our Marines into Tulagi here, the President Jackson, the Haywood, the Neville, which General Rupertus is on, are all like parked right out here in the water, unloading Marines and supplies. Over on the south side, the transport group, which is Task Force Yoke, and under the command of General Vandegrift, have more, of course, but these Japanese cruisers and destroyers are going to launch an attack on the 9th of the 8th, and it turns into a naval disaster. What happened is we'd taken their carriers out, so the Japanese are now launching their navy out of Rabaul. The Japanese still have a very lethal navy, although their carriers have been taken out, and they're going to take out 5 of our basically 5 Allied cruisers either are sunk or heavily damaged. Over 1,000 sailors die. It's the largest loss in the history for the U.S. Navy after Pearl Harbor. The best I can tell, over 1,000 men were lost. Pearl Harbor, we got ambushed. This was an active battle, and it was a disaster. So what happens is when the Japanese come in from Rabaul, and I'll show you where they're coming just in a second, another map, because of that disaster, these transport groups are going to have to pull out. It is actually an absolute miracle that the Japanese turned and went back up to Rabaul in New Britain without taking these transports out, because they were like sitting ducks. But they had to get the heck out of Dodge. This is a closer up map of where our Navy transports were offloading the Marines onto Tulagi. Neville right here is the command, where the command ship is. General Rupertus was here. And the interesting thing about it is, on the night of the 8th, and I think we cover this in the book, General Vandegrift is over, he's down south on Guadalcanal. He's got to go find General Rupertus, who's up here commanding the Tulagi operation, to say, hey, we got to get the heck out of Dodge. So Vandegrift gets in the boat. He's coming across the sound over there, Seal Arc Channel, which becomes known as Iron Bottom Sound because we sink so many ships in there, to try to find Rupertus. He gets lost in the water. As he is getting lost in the water, he's seen these explosions come up from burning ships over near Sabah Island. And so the Marines got left by the Navy, but we had to protect those carriers because that's all we had. So that was the reason. Picture of General Rupertus and his staff at Tulagi Island. A couple of pictures here. I pulled this from the Sunday Star. I was talking to Colonel Bell a minute ago. This used to be kind of like the second paper in Washington after the Washington Post. And Navy launches offensive to drive Japs from Solomons. That's the headlines. That's all that's known. Nobody knows what's going on. I'm just telling you about Sabah Island or our Marines facing a firefight at Tulagi. But the country doesn't really yet know what's happened. After Tulagi falls, this is, again, the first American victory on the ground that we have been able to determine and document in the war. Now, think about this. Think about if you're talking about the war, the American Revolution, and leaving off Lexington and Concord. That's how historically significant this is. If you watch, the Pacific, you'll see our Marines coming in and landing on Guadalcanal without opposition. They changed their strategy, but anyway, this is the area of the Solomon Islands, and I'm hitting the wrong button there. See, so Tulagi is here. There's Florida Islands. We'll go through and look at some of these maps. The Japanese cruisers all throughout the Guadalcanal operation were launching at Rabaul and coming down this area which we call the slot. And they come here generally at night, and they just knock the living out of our Marines on both of these islands, on both Guadalcanal and across the way at Agava. And it was a rough situation. This is just another map showing where the Battle of Sabah Island was fought, Tulagi, Florida, and these are the central points on Guadalcanal. And some of these battles here, Edison's Ridge and Hendersonville, I'll touch on real quickly just in a second. The general, in the meantime, after Tulagi fell, General Vandegrift had General Rupertus at Tulagi. He was going back and forth across Iron Bottom Sound on these boats. And I think he's stepping off back onto Tulagi here. But this is a very dangerous operation every time you cross this channel. As I say, Sabah Sound, or Seal Arc Channel, later became known as Iron Bottom Sound because of all the naval wreckage that was there. On Guadalcanal, after Tulagi fell, there were three major battles: Tenaroo, Alligator Creek, and Edson's Ridge, and the Battle of Henderson Field, which the General Rupertus commanded. Many of y'all knows those. Just picture, this is the first one, Alligator Creek, known as Tenaroo, August 21st, 1942. A month later, we had the Battle of Edson's Ridge. Colonel Edison had been the Raider commander who had led the Raiders into Tulagi just in August, so now he's come back over to Guadalcanal under General Vandegrift's command, and this is the Battle of Edson Ridge. In every case, the Japanese are trying to take this airfield. Because, see, here's the deal. This airfield, Henderson Field, is why we wanted to take Guadalcanal, as many as you know. And so the Japanese are trying on many occasions to break through these perimeters and retake this airfield because it is strategic. Now they've lost their carriers, they've lost their air power. Battle for Henderson Field. This is, of course, General Rupertus getting the Navy Cross from Admiral Nimitz. Result of that, I think Amy showed this. General Rupertus, by the way, in 1943, the 1st Marine Division after Guadalcanal came to Australia, and the general was, Colonel Bell's talking about General Petraeus. General Rupertus, like General Petraeus, was very diplomatically skilled. So here we have Eleanor Roosevelt comes to Australia and drives all the military commanders crazy because of the logistics that are involved with that. But he is designed as her escort there in Melbourne, and that's them together in 1943. She wrote a handwritten letter to him, which we have here. Amy, by the way, has kept all this. She's done her country a great service. My dear General, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, of course, the Army commended General Rupertus for that as well. This is a general area showing the Japanese holdings as we begin the island hopping campaign. And I'm going to talk a little bit about now, after the respite in Australia, General MacArthur, the great General MacArthur, one of the most greatest generals, interesting characters and personalities in American history. He likes the 1st Marine Division so much that he decides he wants it under his own command. So he goes to Roosevelt and argues with Nimitz some, and he becomes a fan of General MacArthur, of General General Rupertus. And so MacArthur, what he's wanting to do, right here where I'm circling, is where the Japanese are launching their ships out of Rabaul and come down to Slot. So the strategy here is to try and surround Rabaul and basically choke it down, okay? So, therefore, here we show the Solomon Islands here, Bougainville, Marines were involved there. But MacArthur wants the 1st Marines to hit over on the east side of New Britain at Cape Gloucester, to put pressure here against Rabaul, as the Marines are moving up this way to put pressure against Rabaul. So in other words, we attack New Britain at Cape Gloucester on Boxing Day, December 26, 1943. A little closer map of the area, you can see where Cape Gloucester is, where the invasion began, and Rabaul is here. Cape Gloucester is a photograph of the invasion. The invasion went well. There's rough waters. We got our guys in, moved in fairly successfully. So this is the general. We have a shot down. I'm not sure what that is in the back, but they're raising the colors there and praying and giving thanks for the victory. Just kind of an area of the operations on Cape Gloucester. I'm not going to go too deep into the weeds here. This is a photograph of the general reading a congratulatory letter from President Roosevelt. I think it came over the radio and was translated, but it was from President Roosevelt to the 1st Marine Divisions for swiftly taking control at Cape Gloucester. After Cape Gloucester, they retired again. They were hoping to go back to Australia for R&R, but they go to a place called Papavu, which apparently is, kind of like Guadalcanal and mosquito infested, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Bob Hope came and entertained the troops, so we captured that picture. Now let's talk about the sweep westward, and then I'll get ready to close here in a second. We have Tulagi, Guadalcanal, we have Cape Gloucester, then we have Peleliu. Now Peleliu is an interesting situation because General MacArthur had promised that I shall return. There's Mindanao. So why take Peleliu? I'll talk about Peleliu in a second. Peleliu is out here as part of the Palau Islands. You can see where this section is near the Philippines is strategically relevant because of its proximity to the Philippines. Shown in red here again, southeast of the Philippines. Peleliu is down It's one of 16 islands in the Peleliu chain, and is about 500 miles off the Philippine coast. Now, there's some key points about Peleliu. I think General Rupertus gets a bad rap on it, but I'll explain that in a second. Codename Operation Stalemate is part of the Peleliu and Mariana Islands campaign. Mariana Islands, of course, is Guam and Tinian, and of course we launched our B-29s out of Tinian to bomb Japan. But the Army also is shifting now from Europe and will join the Marines in force here. The Army had been primarily in Europe. We're beginning to see a shift now. There's a huge debate here. That's what I'm talking about. There's a huge debate between the Army and the Navy about whether to execute the operation at all. Okay, now here's the deal. By the way, we got a Peleliu author, Wes. What's your name again? Tell me your name. Lou? Wrote a book called 15 Weeks, right? 15 days. Pick up 15 days. His father-in-law was the corpsman on Peleliu, so I want to put a plug in for that book. But let me just say this. There's a debate on whether to go at all. MacArthur wanted to go back to the Philippines as he promised. But the issue, of course, is geography. And so if he's moving in to the Philippines, the Japanese are controlling Peleliu, and they could potentially hit him from the backside. He doesn't want that. So initially he's arguing for this invasion. The Navy doesn't want to do it. The Navy wants to go directly into Japan. Now, President Roosevelt was kind of like President Lincoln in a way. He had a way of letting his commanders kind of argue back and forth and back and forth and forth and back, and you got what you got somehow, some way. At the end of the day, the decision was made to attack. It was a joint operation with the Army, Navy, and the Marine Corps, and the 1st Marine Division would lead that wave on September 15th of 42. Now, the other key point about Peleliu is there was a huge shift in the Japanese battle tactics for the first time here. Japanese have been doing this thing, which I call retreat and ambush. They run into, like Guadalcanal, they run back in the jungle and they come back and hit you with these bonsai attacks. They've hit you. I'm oversimplifying. But here, they dig in and resist. So they get into the bunkers, they get here, they get there. So we're going to see something we've never seen before. And as you look at this picture of our Marine LTVs coming in on D-Day in Peleliu, Peleliu was a product, and I don't mean this in a critical manner at all, when I say it was a product of a failure of naval intelligence. And the reason I don't mean that in a critical manner is because, now we've got Predator drones, we got satellites, we have, high altitude planes, we had the Blackbird. Back in those days, we did the best we could in terms of pre-planning intel. You might get a reconnaissance plane over the top of the place, and if you do, you might not see anything. And they were dug into the hills, basically. And we're going to see this again at Iwo Jima in February of 1945 and in Okinawa. So this was the very first time we saw it. So the casualties are going to be higher. 1st Marine Division, let me back up. 1st Marine Division are going to come in here on the southeast section of the island. The island, by the way, I've done a book on Iwo Jima, and so Iwo Jima from the air kind of looks like a pork chop, okay? But this island from the air kind of looks like a stingray. The big part of the stingray here and the tail here. So the Marines are going to hit here. Chesty Puller is involved with this operation, a number of other Marines, and you can see this is a more modern photograph of Peleliu now, but the invasion initially hit on this side of the island. On day one, Marines were facing temperatures up to 115 degrees. This is an African-American regiment. I think these might be the Montfort Marines who were under General Rupertus' command. But it was hot as all get out at the opening, and they were facing Japanese fire up front in the teeth like they'd never seen before. This is a photograph of General Rupertus here. I believe this is Chesty Puller, right, Amy? That Chesty got that right, burying some of the dead there. So it turned out to be an American victory. Got it. An American victory, and the general left and passed away. His wife christened the USS Rupertus here. And as I close out, the question is, could history be repeating itself? We just saw U.S. Pacific Fleet announce Operation or Exercise Valiant Shield 22. Anderson Air Base, USS Ronald Reagan, Abraham Lincoln, et cetera, plus Marines are engaging in this operation. And here, as this operation goes on as we speak, it lasts till the 17th, we have the 1st Marine Division back now in the Palau Islands taking part in this military exercise. So that last part is not in the book, but I do hope that the book will serve its purpose to introduce the story of this great general, to add to history. And I appreciate all that you all are doing. The volunteers for this museum, I meant to thank you all earlier. You are the bread and butter, and you're doing your service to the country to keep history alive. So we will close at this moment. I'm getting the heave-ho in the back there and possibly take some questions. There may be some wine left. I don't know. But anyway, thank you very much.
Good job.
If you have questions, please raise your hand. The first question for either of you two comes from Kent online. He wants to know, what was the general's opinion of the operation at Peleliu? Should it have gone or not?
Can you hear me? Yeah. He didn't live long enough to talk about it. The only thing I know is that he wrote letters to Vandegrift, from General Vandegrift, who's then commandant, about Peleliu, and he didn't. We don't know if he. I mean, he was told what to do. He did what his duty was to do, but I know that he thought Peleliu was a hellhole. He wrote that to Vandegrift.
We have not been able to discover any historical evidence as whether he was in favor of it or opposed to it.
Right.
Like the Navy versus the Army. He probably would have gone with the Navy, my guess, because Admiral Nimitz was his ultimate boss, but we don't know for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good question, though.
We'll get to a question in the center aisle here.
How did he die?
He came back from the Pacific in November 1944, and with a whole slew of Marines, and he was common Marine Corps schools, and he went up to a party in Washington of 1st Marine Division veterans at 8th and I, and he was with my grandmother and my father, and he ended up at that party having a heart attack. And so that was March 25th, 1945. And he was buried the next day at Arlington.
Next question coming from online. Was there anything you found in your pre-war research that indicated he learned from what the Japanese were doing in China that he was able to apply during World War II?
I think what he learned there, not being able to seeing all this war before him and the Japanese tactics, because remember, after Shanghai, there was Nanking, the rape of Nanking, the USS Panay, and the Marines could not do anything. We could not do anything, our country, to respond to what we were seeing. So, I think he was pretty driven and pretty convicted in the mission ahead of him against the Japanese.
Let me add that. When he was in Shanghai in 1937, for a period of 4 months, 200,000 Chinese killed in a period of about 4 months, which is roughly half the number of folks we lost in World War II and America lost. And he witnessed that. He was eyewitness to that, and a handful of other officers as well. And so he knew what the Japanese capabilities were and was uniquely qualified then to take command eventually of the division. I think the Rifleman's creed, frankly, might be a product of that. And if we've got some audio of him. He's obviously a very aggressive military commander, and I think probably he knew that there would need to be American aggression to take out an enemy like that.
We'll get to the general as soon as I get there. Yes, sir.
Were there any tactics or techniques or strategies that the general was known to have fathered or initiated here as he did some of the first major amphibious operations in the Pacific?
Great question. We just actually last week found some audio from the National Archives that where he's talking about the amphibious landings on Cape Gloucester, which he really felt was probably the best uh, best amphibious event that happened in the Pacific. So he really, and I'd be happy to send that to you if I can get your email. But it's really neat. He's going into detail about the strategy and how the Allied efforts really paid off on that, and it went very smoothly as far as an amphibious landing. So I can't say that he was responsible for that. Well, he was commanding general at that time, but he always talked about and even wrote to General Vandegrift how smooth that operation was.
Techniques, Tactics, and Procedures, TTP.
Yeah.
Obviously, his bold maneuver at Peleliu, in my opinion, was kind of a daring and swashbuckling type of maneuver. And
Do you mean Tulagi?
Tulagi, excuse me, yes, by basically dropping out in front of the coral. So clearly, he embraced the element of surprise, and some of the very first marine amphibious actions were based on those. Cape Gloucester went seamlessly. Of course, there's tremendous naval firepower there too, but I don't know if there's anything other than that. But I think that he certainly did pave the way in terms of the amphibious approach of the United States Marine Corps based on those operations.
To your left here in the front row, please.
Hello. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you chose the title you did for the book. I mean, the old breed general seems like he's jumping in and out of boats and getting shot at, and that seems so different from my perception of what I would call a new breed general.
Right. Well, I think well, first of all, our publisher came up with that title. We didn't. We had all these. We had different titles we were going to use, like from the Rifleman's Creed, No Enemy and Peace, or all. But he really was. I mean, and even I've gotten comments that that Marine Corps officers, the higher echelon, wouldn't talk to each other the way they did, or they wouldn't talk to the enlisted men. There wasn't that communication. But during this war in the Pacific, I found there was. He was jumping out of boats and being shot at. Truly, even when he tried to get to Tulagi, there were snipers trying to shoot at him. So they had to back off. He ended up sleeping on the beach on Tulagi. So it was kind of a little the Wild West. And I think it's war in the Pacific is what they were dealing with. And they did communicate with each other on more of a friendly level because there was so much danger everywhere.
It's a very good question.
Yeah.
And publishers, at the end of the day, since they're paying you to write the book, they have veto power. But there were discussions on titles.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the 1st Marine Division is known as the Old Breed. And of course, Sledge's wonderful book on what the Old Breed helped to popularize the name amongst the public. And I think the publisher, this is the first real biography about the general who commanded that division longest in the war. And I think they made that call. So, but there are other good titles out there too, but you asked a very good question.
Yeah.
To your right here, halfway back.
Hi, Don and Amy. Thank you for your presentation. My question is for Amy. I'm just wondering, how old were you when you realized how important your grandfather was? So when did you realize his role and everything that he did and all that stuff?
Well, I think probably pretty young, not to the extent, since I've done all this research and we've done all this research, that I now know more. But when I was little, we have the banner of the USS Rupertus. So when it was launched, we have a big canvas thing that went on the front, a shield that went on the front of the ship when it was launched in 1945. And so I kind of figured that was important. We had a couple photographs of Guadalcanal and that sort of thing, but I didn't really know until I started researching how profound this was. And so, yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, Amy Peacock and Don Moore, thank you very much for a wonderful conversation.
So thank you, Amy and Don, and thanks to all of you here and at home, those watching at home and online. I appreciate that. Our authors will be outside in the ballroom to sign copies of Old Breed General. And They didn't pick the title, but that's okay. And want to remind everybody that our next event is next Thursday. We've got Sir Ron Emitter will come and present on his 2 latest books on China's war and China's memories as our General Raymond D. Mason Distinguished Lecturer. So that's Thursday, June 23rd. And with that, I will say have a good and safe evening. And one last round of applause for Amy, Rupertus Peacock, and Don Moore. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming. Well done.